Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com, How to Make an NYPD Themed Knife, Part 2. Now this knife is made from 1095 high carbon steel. It has the New York City skyline, including the Statue of Liberty and the letters NYPD etched onto the blade. It has a Carvex, which is a micarta type product, black waving U.S. flag as scales. In the first part of this two-part series, we detailed how the knife started. It started with a high carbon steel knife blank, and then using a 2x72 grinder and a tilt table. I couldn't remember the name of it. Tilt table. I showed you how I beveled the edges on the blade. This particular blade has flat bevels. And once the bevels were done, still in part one of the series, we detailed how he took that blade and started to etch the design right onto the blade. Now, I did the etching after I rough ground the bevels because I wanted to see how high the bevels came up on the blade. The etching was done with a 12-volt car battery charger and salt water, as well as some self-adhesive vinyl stickers. When the stickers are removed, it exposed the etched area underneath, which again is that New York City skyline. And then I used a similar process to go back and etch the NYPD onto the blade. Part one also detailed heat treating and tempering. The heat treating was pretty basic. You basically bring it up to temperature to the point where that 1095 is no longer magnetic. Quench it in oil. The tempering happens after that. You basically put it in an oven, 375 for 2.5 hours, and then you let it cool overnight without opening the door. I then had my friend Greg Ferraro come over with his whetstone sharpening system, and he put a razor sharp edge onto the blade. That all happened in part one. In part two, we're going to mount the Carvex scales, finish off the blade, and then also laser etch the gentleman's or my customer's badge number right onto the blade. So this is the Carvex black and white waving flag scales. I've glued some blue liners onto the back of them. My customer wanted thinner scales, so I'm using the same center scribe that I use for bevels to mark a line all the way around the perimeter of these scales. Now the only way I really have to take these down to size is back over to the 2x72. Before I do that, I just want to show you how I'm going to position these scales on the blade. I cut out a template of the handle, and that's basically where I'm going to cut out that Carvex. I want to have those 3 stars on each side of the handle. I then took each scale over to the 2x72. I have an Oregon blade maker, 2x72, beautiful machine, affordable, and it really works nice. And just very carefully watching that scribed line on the edge of the Carvex material, I just slowly sanded these things down to size. Now gluing up the scales, I use my friend Jason Northgard's system. It probably takes a little bit longer than most people, the way that most people mount their scales, but I basically mount each half of the scale completely separately. So I'll glue one half of the scales onto the blade, lining them up perfectly the way that I want them, that top leading edge. Of course, the blade was prepped with sandpaper and alcohol wipe, and the Carvex was also primed with an alcohol wipe to degrease it. Once that scale is, or once that glue is dry, I will drill through the pre-existing pinholes in the blade and through that half of the scale material. And then I can cut out the excess material just on my little pin saw. So right now you end up with scales on half of the blade that have the hole drilled through the handle as well as the tang of the knife. Then I'm going to mount the other side. Again, I'm going to clamp this into position exactly where I want it, get it all lined up, and then I'll basically set that aside and let that dry. Before I do that, whenever you clamp down on these scales, you always get a little bit of that two-part epoxy that squeezes out the top, basically onto the blade. So one real nice way to get rid of all of that epoxy off of the blade, especially the etched areas of the blade, which have little deep grooves, wipe off the majority with a paper towel, and then just take an alcohol wipe, fold it up, and using the sharp edge of a plastic knife, just run it back and forth right along that angle or that connection between the blade and the scale. And that gets rid of any of the glue that's oozed out from underneath that scale material. Anyway, finishing off the scales, now both sides have the scale material glued to them. I'm going to perfectly position the quarter-inch drill through the side that I've already drilled the hole and the tang, and then just continue that hole through the bottom scale. It's just a nice way of getting the pinholes perfectly aligned with both halves of the scales, as well as through the pre-existing holes on the tang. I think I made that explanation a little bit more complicated than it needed to be. I then cut out the rest of the scales on that pin saw, and now it's going to come time to I already glued the pins in here, quarter-inch brass pins. I want to grind these down. I went back over to the 2x72. Just make sure that you cut the pins pretty close to size. You don't want to be grinding a lot of that brass and creating some heat. Heat will damage that Carvex material. So, dip it in water in between, but be careful grinding those pins down to size. You can shape these scales any way you want. People shape them on the 2x72. I happen to like using a disc or an angle grinder with a flap sanding wheel. This is an 80 grit. It's actually a worn 80 grit flap sanding wheel. And very carefully, I just use this to bring the scales down to size height-wise, to bevel in the front of the scales, to start to shape the curvature of the handle so that it fits your hand nicely. Now, we'll need a bunch of sanding after this. I happen to like this Carvex material a lot. A lot of people don't because it doesn't polish up as easily or as nicely as some of the other acrylic products that are out there. But Carvex has some wonderful designs, and it's definitely a product worth looking at. I also used a Dremel grinder to kind of smooth out some of the rough edges. The secret to getting a good finish on this Carvex is sanding. Now, I used a palm sander, and I sanded, I think, to 220. But the real secret is going to be hand sanding. You really have to take this stuff almost to a 2,000 grit. So I started with 400. I sanded off all of the scratches with a 400. I did the same thing with a 600 grit. Then I went to 1,000, and then I went to 2,000. The 2,000 grit really makes a huge difference in getting a good result when you start to buff this stuff. It takes a little bit of time, but it's really worth it. Now, I've had some difficulty polishing this and buffing it in the past. I think I've resolved all of those issues. So I'm using a product called a P27. It's a plastic, a compound that's used for polishing plastic. And I'm using this on a felt wheel that's dedicated to just polishing plastic. So there's going to be no little pieces of brass in there that are going to scratch the plastic. That P27, I got it from USA Knife Maker. Now, you don't want to push in with a lot of force on this buffing wheel. Kind of a medium amount of force in order to buff. You're just taking out all of those little tiny scratches from the 2000 grit paper. And then I move over to the other side of the buffing wheel, which is just a dry felt buffing wheel. And that's going to give it that final polish, that final luster. The next step in this process, I went over to my nephew's machine shop, Dennis Lee's machine shop. He was kind enough to lend me his laser etching machine, and his son, my great nephew Devin, spent a decent amount of time with me and showed me how this laser etcher worked. Really a neat machine. He lined it up, perfectly where I wanted the badge number for my customers' badge number to be etched onto the blade. And you see the laser turns green, and all sorts of little sparks start to jump off of it. It's a very fast process. Only took a few seconds to etch the numbers onto the blade, and really did a nice job. So now this particular knife is basically done. It's got blade etching done with electro etching as well as laser etching. I finished it off with a kydex sheath. The handle has, it's a black waving US flag with blue liners. That's the finished product. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this YouTube channel. By all means, join us on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. Feel free to post pictures of your own builds. And also check us out on DIYEasyCrafts.com. The knife blank used on this knife, the 1095 high carbon steel blank, is available on www.DIYEasyCrafts.com. Thank you very much.